Hello, I'm Sean Lay, and this is the programme which brings together leading commentators, BBC specialists and the foreign correspondents who film and report for audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week, how patient will people be as the number of COVID patients declines? Peaceful but persistent in Myanmar, but what will make the generals listen? And the not-so-splendid isolation of North Korea. The Dateline panel this week, we're hoping to be joined shortly by the Italian journalist and documentary filmmaker Annalisa Piras. Jeff McAllister is already with us. He's a former White House and diplomatic correspondent and ex-London bureau chief for Time magazine. He's also a lawyer, so I'll be minding my P's and Q's. And with me in the studio, Celia Hatton, the BBC's Asia Pacific editor. Good to have you with us again, Celia. Now, let's begin with the practical questions of the world not being able to vaccinate itself out of the COVID pandemic. So although the UK's progress inoculating its citizens has been widely praised, the statement expected Monday from Boris Johnson on exiting lockdown is likely to be heavy with caveats. Jeff, Saturday's newspapers were full of good news, some speculation, but a concrete commitment that the government has confirmed that people in care homes will now be able to meet a relative indoors and hold hands for the first time for some of them in nearly a year. Do you, though, suspect that this might be an attempt to sweeten the pill?
Actually, from the other indications, of course, we don't know until Boris Johnson says what the plans are. There's talk of a wholesale return to school in a few weeks, too. Actually, I think it's more than sweetening the pill. It looks like the trend lines of hospitalizations, of deaths, of the R rate, all the indicators are positive and quite steeply so. And this appears to be not so much a consequence of vaccination, although that's been a success, but of social distancing measures. But the vaccinations are also starting to make a difference, and that's going to be a geometric progression too, I think. So I think the government's actually in a pretty sweet place here. As long as the trend lines are good, I think they'll be getting a lot of running room from the public. I think what the public doesn't like is stop, start, reverse. But as long as things seem to be getting better, I think people are quite tolerant of the mess. I mean, the Labour Party focus groups, as Keir Starmer was trying to figure out how to get some purchase on Boris Johnson, said, we don't like it when you attack the government. We'd like you to be working together. And anyway, we don't think you lot would do any better. And I think there's a large baseline of ease. As long as the numbers keep going in the right direction, I think the public is going to be okay. In this country, in the US, elsewhere, of course, other countries where things are not as advanced, it may be different.
Annalisa, thank you very much for being with us. Vaccination has been a problem in much of continental Europe. We've got at least one governor in Italy saying this week he's looking for buying vaccines of his own. He's so frustrated by the slower pace. And Italy had a hellish start to this pandemic last spring. He's got a new government just taken office. The man they used to call Super Mario Draghi. They called him that a decade ago during the financial crisis. How difficult a balancing act do he and other European leaders face in easing lockdown?
It's a gigantic challenge, of course, because we're all in the same situation, basically, trying to understand when is the right moment to ease the restrictions, when it's safe. And at the same time, we have this race against time to vaccinate most of the population, and especially the most vulnerable. But of course, the answer cannot be everyone on their own. So the governor of Veneto is now backtracking. He tried to buy vaccines on his own, and it looks like it was possibly a fraud. It was a con. We didn't know where these vaccines were coming from. So the entire very sad episode highlighted how, in the end, it was the right decision to try to do it at a EU level to avoid exactly this kind of situation in which people, understandably, they are dealing with matters of life and death, so they want the vaccines. But the answers cannot be go and get them wherever you can, because they might not be safe. In fact, it looks like the governor of Veneto was ready to pay 5 times the price. You understand that having a black market for vaccines, everybody on their own, it would be a recipe for disaster, and it would be unsafe for the people. So the EU did the right choice in trying to centralize and keep a tab on this, avoiding a vaccine war across regions and countries in Europe. The only problem is that, as everybody knows, the EU is not a country. It doesn't have a national health service. So it has to provide vaccines to 27 countries, to more than 400 million people. It cannot be done overnight. So there are logistical problems. But as you say, the arrival of Super Mario at the head of the Italian government does bring with itself consequences that go far beyond Italy, because he's seen as an extremely capable manager. He managed, after all, the European Central Bank with 19 central banks involved. So he has a very solid experience.
And he's almost managing, it feels like he's almost managing as many political parties as he kind of tries to cohere together the coalition. Let me bring in Celia, because Annalisa talked there about the risk of a vaccine war. We, in a sense, are starting to see worrying signs of that globally, aren't we? Just in terms of the stresses that this is causing. I think Emmanuel Macron saying on Friday at the Munich Security Conference, look, if the British and the Americans, the Europeans don't give vaccines now to help health workers in Africa, the African countries are going to look to China and Russia. They're going to get their vaccines that way. And any confidence and faith they have in the Western way, if there is such a thing, will be evaporated.
Well, of course, and that's already happening. We've been hearing for weeks now about vaccine deals that China is striking with, first starting with regional players near China. But of course, China's been giving offering big vaccine deals for several weeks now, ever since they were able to announce that they had 3 workable vaccines. Now, of course, there are some challenges with those vaccines. There have been some questions about the release of data from phase 3 trials from those Chinese-made vaccines. But of course, vaccine diplomacy is alive and well in Beijing. What's interesting are some of the countries that have said, look, we're actually not going to bother with vaccines. We know we're not going to get them for quite some time. Vietnam was one of those countries that's done a really quite good job at keeping the virus at very low levels, maintaining lockdown. They kind of threw up their hands quite early and said, we're not even going to try to contend for any of these quite expensive vaccines. They've just announced this week that they're getting 30 million doses through the COVAX scheme, the WHO-run scheme that's supposed to give vaccines to the world's 20% most vulnerable. So I think the message coming from Vietnam is, look, you can just sit tight and wait, and you will get vaccines eventually. You don't necessarily have to go through the Beijing route.
Jeff, that raises an interesting question, doesn't it? Whether one of the consequences of this pandemic is that parts of the world will emerge sooner than others, and that a different sort of global competition, both political and economic, will come from that uneven emergence from the restrictions of pandemic.
I think you're right. I think it's inevitable. Like any gigantic event, both health and economic, this is going to have lumps, and things are going to be different in the end. The idea that, I think it is almost old-fashioned geopolitics that is getting the Western leaders now to make a bigger noise about getting vaccines out to developing countries. But China and Russia are already quite far advanced in this. And I think we have to get used to the fact that China in particular has lots of cards to play, and it's going to be playing them in a sophisticated fashion. And of course, if it's putting vaccines in people's arms, who's really to complain?
Let's move on and talk about a country that has had its share of the headlines over the last few weeks. Peaceful protest inside Myanmar, diplomatic pressure and sanctions against military leaders from the outside. And on Friday, the first recorded death. A woman in the capital, Naypyidaw, shot in the head as police dispersed a crowd there. Can any of this, though, restore civilian authority? It was never really control, extinguished by the army those 3 weeks ago. And of course, one forgets how quickly events move, Jeff, but it was only, 12 days after Joe Biden took office as US president, the first significant foreign policy challenge he's faced. How realistic is it, the aspiration that's been expressed not least by his Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, that Myanmar should return to civilian control?
I think the statement of Secretary Blinken was more of a kind of a statement like the ones made by President Biden about NATO. It's that the old U.S. is back. We're going to put human rights in our foreign policy. We aren't going to just say nothing when bad things happen to democracy, as would have happened in previous times. But in practical terms, there really isn't a lot that the U.S. Has leverage to accomplish here. The trade with Myanmar is small. The trade between Myanmar and China and the 1,200-mile border, much larger. China has much different interests in consorting with the generals than the U.S. does. There are small sanctions, but there have already been sanctions. So I think this is symbolic more than anything else. I think the interest of, you see the young people using the internet and using social media and other kinds of social protests to signal that this is not your parents' kind of demonstrations, but still the government has so many tools of repression. And after all, Aung San Suu Kyi was in house arrest for 15 years previously. I think we have to expect a very long and messy attempt to try to put pressure on them to accommodate their own complex domestic political forces.
Annalisa, Jeff mentions Aung San Suu Kyi there. Of course, she's a political prisoner again, perhaps seen rather differently than as she was the first time around. A lot of criticism of her willingness to defend the military over its suppression of the Muslim minority, the Rohingya people, many of whom, of course, are now in neighbouring Bangladesh. Do you think that affects at all the calculation that's being made in European capitals about how to treat what's happened in Myanmar?
I hope not. I hope not. Of course, there has been serious damage done to the reputation of Aung San Suu Kyi, and that's very sad because she was a symbol well beyond Myanmar. But I wouldn't expect war diplomacy to take that into consideration. After all, what matters today more than ever is the respect of democracy. And she has had a very resounding mandate from the electorate to lead the country. And this must be defended and upheld, regardless of what are probably serious flaws in her leadership at times.
Celia, China referred to this coup. Of course, the Myanmar military say it wasn't a coup. It's a corrective of a defective election that they say was fraudulent. The Chinese called it a major cabinet reshuffle, which I suppose is a bit like akin to calling the British War, the English War of the Roses, a sort of small family dispute. Is it possible that this is actually a coup that was approved in China, that China may have seen this as something that was beneficial from its perspective?
I think there have been questions raised about that, but actually I don't get that feeling, because the Chinese ambassador came out a few days ago, the Chinese ambassador to Myanmar, and said, look, we had friendly relations with both sides, with Aung San Suu Kyi's party and also with the military. And frankly, China's always had a very complicated relationship with Myanmar. In this case, I don't think China's really happy about this. And the ambassador said very clearly, he said, this situation is absolutely not what we wanted to see. Now, we should point out that China is Myanmar's largest trading partner. Of course, they're very important. But Myanmar also has to think about its biggest investors. And in the region, its biggest investors are Japan, Thailand, Singapore. Those are some of the countries that it's really going to have to start paying attention to. And those military generals, this isn't the Myanmar of decades past. This is a Myanmar that's much more integrated into the global economy. And so if the generals really want to ignore the calls of many of their own people, 3/4 of civil servants are on strike at the moment in Myanmar. If they want to push on with this and try to impose their own ruling, they're really going to have to think about the region in general, not just China.
And that's a really powerful point, isn't it, Annalisa? Because, I mean, you've made much of your reputation as a documentary filmmaker. We are this time seeing something we never saw during years of military repression in Myanmar. We're seeing images, we're seeing pictures, some extraordinarily powerful images, those flotillas of small boats, for example, marshalled in protest, the buildings covered in the colours of Aung San Suu Kyi's party. How much difference can that make in maintaining international interest in Myanmar?
Well, I think it was during First World War that Virginia Woolf saw the photographs coming out of war and said, we will never have war ever again, because now that people can see the horror of it, we will just stop it because we can see it. Unfortunately, it didn't work that way, and it doesn't work that way now. But images and footage still have an extraordinary importance. The problem is that with the fragmentation of the media system, with social media, with internet, with Facebook, we're seeing the enormous controversy now between Facebook and Australia. Images and news are not anymore kind of delivered to the people with authority and credibility. So there is the risk that even images that have an extraordinary potential to wake up people to the reality of what is happening get dispersed into the noise and the confusion. And now with technology, we also know that with deep fakes, you can fake them. So there is also a growing distrust in what you see. So I think that your question points to a very fundamental problem of our times, which is information and how you can transmit those real, meaningful images of the horrors of the things that are happening to wake up people from their slumber.
Jeff, that raises a really interesting point related to what you said at the start of this section about human rights. A lot of people saw images as part of the case for suggesting that war crimes were committed in the suppression of the Muslim minority in Myanmar. I spoke to a former head of the British Army who said he wondered if that might have been a partial motive for the coup, that the military were worried that maybe the civilian government, when it's got full power, would be willing to hand them over to international justice. Is there an appetite in America now, under Joe Biden, for international justice to take its course?
I think, as always, there's more of an appetite for justice for one's enemies than one's friends. The failure of the United States to be part of the International Criminal Court, which I think would be very difficult for even a Democratic administration with human rights interests like Biden's to try to return to, means that I think it probably will be not unserious attempt to try to link human rights back into American foreign policy more, but with the usual caveats and hypocrisies that are always involved in this. I think it's probably likely to be better than not doing it, but it's never going to be pure or the sole or even the major influence, I think, on what the U.S. does.
Jeff, thank you. Let's stay in the region. For almost 50 years, Myanmar was isolated internationally. North Korea remains so. The borders with China and Russia have been shut for more than a year now. COVID, say the propagandists in Pyongyang, has been kept out. Still, it's applied for a share of the vaccine shots being supplied to poorer countries. South Korea even claims its neighbour has tried to steal the intellectual property behind that. I mean, in a sense, there are probably some countries that might feel a bit of sympathy if it did try that, because they're so frustrated that they can't produce the vaccines at home. But parking that thought, do we have any sense at the moment of just how fragile North Korea is?
I think North Korea is a country on its knees at the moment. I mean, it's often been said that North Korea is in the perfect storm at the moment. This was a country that even before COVID-19 hit the world, 40% of the population was going hungry. 7 out of 10 babies weren't getting the minimum amount of calories needed in the country. That's according to the UN. So North Korea was one of the first countries to lock down its borders with China. It did so in late January, and it's maintained that lockdown. I mean, against its own wish, its own interests, really. Its major trading partner, of course, is China, just over the border. But we've seen a drop of trade with China down 75%. So,
presumably, that's the official trade, and there's always been, bluntly, sanctions-busting trade as well, hasn't there, anyway?
Absolutely. And this is a country that has normally a really porous border between China and North Korea. That border, by all accounts, has really been locked down. And so we have sanctions, years and years of sanctions imposed by the UN and regionally. We have the imposition of a quite strict COVID lockdown. And then, of course, we have some natural disasters that have been battering North Korea, drought coupled with typhoons. So Kim Jong-un really seems to be in a very difficult position. He's been in power for 9 years now, but he seems to be shuffling senior leaders more rapidly than ever. He appointed a new person to be in charge of the economy. And then just last week, he took that person out of power and said, you haven't been doing enough. Some targets are too high, some targets are too low. So he seems to be floundering. He's apologized repeatedly to his own people for the economic missteps. Where do we go from here? I think he's going to try to do whatever he can to, yes, get a vaccine, but also to get some of those sanctions lifted.
Donald Trump saw a potential to do something fresh with North Korea, Jeff. Does Joe Biden, do you think, see any kind of potential in North Korea?
I think the potential for a lot of trouble. I don't see what the grounds are for a big deal. I mean, the U.S. holy grail for decades was denuclearization in return for some kind of lifting of sanctions and return to the world economy. I think the nuclear program is too far advanced, and the dependence of the regime on the nuclear program for its survival and the people who are supporting it is just way too intense to think that that might be possible. I think it's a concern that there might be saber rattling, as there has been before, in order to get attention from the West and try to break sanctions. It's interesting that one of the good ways that North Korea is now making money is computer fraud, which does not require the infrastructure of old-fashioned sanctions busting. They're quite effective at it. They're stealing from banks, central banks, ATM networks, currency trading networks. They have to spend the money, but the nuclear program appears to still be robust. And even though it does seem to be a perfect storm, there doesn't seem to be any graceful landing. Is there a Prague Spring? No. Is there going to be some effort to make the West do something using nuclear diplomacy? It seems more likely.
Celia, this is not the most stable part of the world at the best of times, and there are those of China's neighbours who think it's doing its bit to stir up things with its actions around the South China Sea, with its rhetoric towards towards Taiwan. Do you see much changing in the region in the near future? Because you talked before Christmas about even the possibility of an invasion of Taiwan. Of course, China wouldn't see it as an invasion. It says it's part of China anyway, but quite a lot of the rest of the world would.
Well, look, I think this is a region that's really got all of its eyes on Washington at the moment, because we haven't quite seen how Joe Biden's strategy for the region might play out. Now, he has a lot of people who were in office in Obama's time. He's brought many people on that team to come to work with him. So the idea that he said is that he will try to unite with his allies, unite with other global democracies, other like-minded countries, in order to really put pressure on China. That really could change the region. But how will Beijing react to that idea? And I think really that a lot of players in the region, Taiwan included, are really looking to see how much of the Trump administration's policies will be carried over through the Biden years, and how much of the tone will really change with Joe Biden in office.
So however much the world changes, for now at least, the world still waits to see what Washington will do. We'll wait to see ourselves. But let me just ask one final thought. We're almost up to a year since the first lockdowns began. A tip from each of you, just briefly, the one thing that's kept you going during the pandemic, during those lockdowns. Annalisa first.
Tiramisu. The Italian cake, which can be very easily done at home. It takes a little time and it makes everybody happy. You can do it in a kind of kids-friendly version, and you can do for the grown-up with a little bit more room on the bottom. So I highly recommend it. We have been consuming loads of it, and it has cheered us up.
I think we know what you're saying. Jeff?
Well, gin and soda has been my new reform rather than gin and tonic. Less calories and therefore more survivable.
Yeah, I always used to love the fact people had full fat gin and they'd ask for a low fat tonic. But as you say, it's often the gin that's the real problem. Some great regional gins around the world, by the way, developing. People are improvising with distilleries of their own in lockdown. Celia?
I've been planning a series of trips. I don't know when I'm going to take them, but, I want to go to India, back to India to see friends. I want to go on a big backpacking trip. I like planning trips. So that's what I've been doing through lockdown, just to remind myself that one day this will be over.
One day it will. And we're over now. Dateline London for this week. Do join Geeta and her guests at the same time next weekend. For now, from Jeff, from Celia, and from Annalisa and myself, have a good week.